Morning. Too many tall people at this church with the microphones way up here. I don't even use this one. I use this one. Oh. Mirror on the stage. Who's the best preacher in this age? Craig Eckstein. Did you hear that? Didn't say Jack Goodwin, it said Craig Eckstein. Didn't say Eddie Hendricks either. I don't believe that's true. Never heard of Craig Eckstein. Who is he? What a great challenge we heard from Craig last week to the parents in raising our kids in the kingdom of God. The takeaway for me was this: is God's heart and God's passion my heart and my passion, or I just go to church and live my life my own way? That's a challenging thought, isn't it? Especially if we want to raise our kids in the Lord. And I know we want to raise our kids growing up and teaching them to be faithful, obedient Christians. But as Craig reminded us, we have to be intentional about that. We have to be. Now, speaking of being intentional, Craig did mention that I bought Aiden a Carson Wentz jersey. Aiden is a big Eagles fan, not the musicians, the football team. But what Craig didn't tell you was that I bought Aiden the Carson Wentz jersey because it was on the I don't play for the Eagles team anymore rack, and it was about $50 cheaper than any other Eagles jersey. But I do believe, as Craig mentioned, that Carson Wentz is a man of God and he does his best, and I think that's a great example of someone that we could follow, a sports person at least. So here's a picture of my Aiden wearing his Carson Wentz jersey, and he's wearing it live today. And if you want a picture taken with Aiden wearing his Carson Wentz jersey, he's only going to charge you $1. And so that's the family discount. And so there you go. You can look at that picture, or if you want a live picture, again, $1 made out to Aiden McGuigan. So in our culture today, I don't know if bombarded is the right word, but it might be the right word. But wouldn't you agree that it's impressed on us what we should look like or be like? And what I mean look like in the areas of how we dress, how we act, and how we speak. What I'm saying is how we appear on the outside as well as on the inside. Now, I'm not saying, because there's people in this world that want to shape us, our parents being one, as Craig reminded us last week. But there are other people in this world who want to shape us, and shape us in such ways that suits them that are not God's. And you know who those people are. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but where it goes astray is this. When we have these unrealistic expectations on people to dress a certain way, or act a certain way, or speak a certain way, and then it's when we don't align ourselves to that way of thinking that we're ignored, that we're shunned, that we're looked down upon, that we're made fun of, or we're persecuted for the things that we believe. For Christians, I believe the way to combat this, and it boils down to deciding how we are going to see ourselves. How are we Christians going to see ourselves? See, and believe me when I say it's not just our young people who aren't comfortable in their own skin, who struggle with poor self-image, who look in other places for acceptance, leaving behind the truths of that we are knit together, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made in the likeness and image of God. Now, I believe there are a few different reasons that we go after these images other than what God says about us. And I believe it's as simple as this: listening to the wrong voice. We listen to the voice of the culture and not God's voice. We listen to the voice of our peers and not God's voice. We listen to the voice of our parents, who don't always remind us that we are Christians, even though we've got Christian parents. And I'm not here, and I didn't say that to beat up the parents. And maybe this one is the most important one. We can also listen to our own voice that whispers the lies that we have mentally rehearsed over the years. You're no good. You're not good enough. She's prettier than you. She's more popular than you. He has more followers than you. He's more athletic than you. The girls like him more than you. So you're not enough. Am I walking on your street? Do you listen to that voice? You see, that's the reality for many Christians, whether we're brave enough to own it or not. And as a reminder, a purpose to preach about God in every sermon that I preach from this pulpit, in beholding our God. And with this lesson, I want to remind us that every human is created in the image and the likeness of God. And that God's voice, when He says what we'll read about in Genesis 1:26 in a second, that let's make man in our image and our likeness, that's the voice that we need to listen to. You see, without having that truth as our foundation of belief, we'll continually look elsewhere. We'll continue to look at other people, listen to other voices and images, and they constantly say, you're not enough, which means we're lacking. See, we live in a culture that is more than happy to present false pictures and ideals of images to all of us. But listen to this truth. Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. So God created man in His own image, male and female. He created them. What does God want us to know from these verses? What does God want to teach us? What does God want to give us a conviction about from these verses? Well, we see from these two Bible verses that the Bible teaches that all humans are a part of God's creation, that all humans are a continuation of the story of God that was started all the way back in the beginning. The Bible teaches that all humans are a reflection of the image of God in a way that animals and other created things are not. Now, this is not the first time you're hearing this, and it won't be the last. God places a high value on God's final creation, which is humankind. From the womb to the tomb, precious and valuable in God's heart. Precious and valuable in God's eyes. Jim McGuigan, in his commentary on Genesis, says this: we're told that the man was created in the image of God, male and female. Whatever else that means, and we aren't told exactly what that means, it means that God is a community being. God created man in a plural unity to reflect the church and its relationship with Christ. Did you hear me say that? Being made in the image of God is a reflection of a God who is a community being. I may or may not come back to that community being idea. Don't hold your breath, but maybe hold your breath. So what does it mean then? What does it mean then that we are made in the image of God? What is God trying to teach us? What is God trying to tell us about who we are? What is He trying to say to give us a conviction about who we are? Does it mean that we are a reflection of the glory of God? Does it mean that God has a body like ours? Does it mean that we're God-like, having the ability to reason and to speak and to create? Does it mean that we're image bearers when we show love or kindness or patience or forgiveness? You see, I believe it's critical to consider who we are daily. For if we don't, we're going to allow ourselves to let others tell us who we are and how we should speak and how we should act and what we should say. And we're easily led astray, aren't we? Who doesn't feel that kind of pressure to listen to the other voices? So keep considering Craig's question again of, is God's heart my heart? Is God's passion my passion? You remember from a couple of weeks ago that I spoke about God is good. And because we are created in the image and likeness of God, we can also be good as a result of our relationship with God. For God is a community being, and so are we. Now, we may not always choose to do good, but we get the opportunity to be good. Unlike the animals, we can choose to be moral and make moral decisions. And when we view ourselves through God's eyes, we then get a correct view or correct image of ourselves. And when we get that true and correct image of ourselves, then we get to live as His followers, His faithful, obedient followers. Would you pray with me? God, we thank You that we are created in Your image. We thank You that You love us above all Your creation. Fill us so that when people see us, they see You and praise Your name. Amen. Mirror, mirror on the stage, who's the preacher that doesn't act his age? Billy McGuigan? That can't be right. I've already said to you that humans were created with unique abilities, which are absent in all the other created things. But we humans, we mirror the divine nature of God. You see, if we're going to be image bearers of God, and we should be because we are made in His image and His likeness, we may not always live up to that most holy calling. So what are we to do? What are we to do? Who will be an example for us? The truth is, there is only one human who reflected the image of God to the degree that bears imitating, and that is Jesus. Listen to this from Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. The Bible tells us in several different places that God's nature, that God's character, that God's purpose is seen in Jesus of Nazareth. And both the Old Testament and the New Testament teach that no one has ever seen God. Richard read that to us from John chapter 6. But we do read this in John 1:18. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made Him known. Richard said that in John chapter 6 too. In other words, Jesus is Jesus has made the invisible visible. Now, staying with John in the book of John, just for a wee moment. We were studying John 14 in the Bible class on Wednesday night, and we heard this from John 14 and verse 8. Philip said, "Show us the Father." And Jesus responds in verse 9 and says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." And what that means is, whatever we see Jesus doing, that's what God is like. I mentioned that a couple of 3 weeks ago, didn't I? For example, if we see Jesus serving, it tells us that God is a servant. If we see Jesus showing compassion, it tells us that God is a compassionate God. If we see Jesus forgiving, it tells us that God is a forgiving God. That's what it means when we read verses like Colossians 1:15 that says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. The invisible, Jesus, the invisible becomes visible. In Jesus, the invisible God becomes visible. Now, with all this talk of image and being the image, we can't help think about what I just talked about in Genesis 1:26 and 27. And then if we reflect on Genesis 1:26 and 27, you can't help but think that we're not in Eden anymore. Kind of like, what's their name? Dorothy and Toto weren't in Kansas anymore. When we reflect on the garden and God creating the way He did and making people in His image and His likeness, whatever we say about Genesis 1, the world today is a far cry from Genesis chapter 1. Wouldn't you agree? Things have changed. These days we wake up to find out where the latest shooting happened and was it near us? There's so much violence in the world, so much hatred in our world. It's clear that mankind is not what they were meant to be because we were made for so much more. Wouldn't you agree that we are not living up to our full potential as community beings? God never wanted the world and the people to turn out the way we've turned it out. We've messed it up. But at the climax of God's creation, He makes people in His image and His likeness. And He says in Genesis 1:31, don't miss that, okay? Everything was how it was meant to be. And then something happened. We humans, we listened to the first wrong voice and believed that we can become gods. It wasn't enough for humans to be made in God's likeness. And we still do. God's heart's desire should have been enough for us, but it wasn't. It wasn't. Maybe I'm reading into this. When God said, let there be light, and there was light. Or God said, let the stars and the moon and the sun do what they do, and they did what they had to do. Not making the text say something that it may not be saying. But when God says, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, I think it speaks to us in a different way. Imagine God sighing. Just imagine. I'm not saying He did. But imagine God sighing. Know what is going to happen when He creates humans in His likeness and in His image. Knowing what God knows, He knows how everything's going to turn out. He knows how Adam and Eve are going to rebel in the garden. He knows what trouble that we're going to get ourselves into and how we humans are going to treat each other. And He still says, let's make man in our image, in our likeness. The truth is, He said it because God saw the potential in mankind that He didn't see in the animals, that He didn't see in the stars, that He didn't see in the moon and all the other created things. Jesus is the image and the visible representation of the invisible God. This Jesus is everything that God is. And if we want to see God, we look at Jesus. And if the world today wants to see God, they are to look at the church. They are to look at the church. They are to look at the church. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Do you see Christ in me at all? What would that answer be in response? Yes? Yeah. The answer is yes. Be confident about that, okay? This Jesus, this same Jesus who came to the earth to tell people and show people who God is, this same Jesus, He told the story one day. A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho who got beat up by some robbers. And two religious men who were to reflect the image and likeness of God saw him and walked on by. And a Samaritan saw him and stopped and helped him. It's a story that you're very familiar with, isn't it? We call it the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a story that's to reflect our love for God, shown in how we interact with our neighbors. Yes? Look, if we are ever to show God how much we love Him and respect what He has created, humans, those who are made in His likeness, we show it by how we interact with our neighbors. For we are like God, we are community beings. But there's something else, and I think a little bit more serious, that we need to consider from this passage. There was more than one person who was robbed on the road to Jericho. The two religious men, the two men who just came from worship, were robbed, and they didn't know it. They were robbed by bad religion. They were robbed by bad Bible teaching and lack of application. They were robbed thinking that once they left the church building, they stopped worshiping God. They didn't love their neighbor. They weren't community beings. They didn't show God how much they loved God. For they walked on by. Church, you know what? We need more than information. We want transformation. We want more like Jesus, don't we? We're not just wanting, give us more information. We've got enough information. What we need is transformation so we make application. Listen, we can be easily, how do I word this? We can be robbed by bad religion and bad Bible teaching if there's no application. And so we walk on by. We can be robbed by believing the Christian life and worship of God is about church attendance and putting money in it and attending Bible classes. Those are good things to do. It's a good place to start, but not stay. The truths we learn must be acted out, for we are community beings like God. Are you just after information? Are you just after what the image of God and the likeness of God means? Or do you really want transformation? Then you have to apply the truths to your life. Church, we have to see everyone we come in contact with as made in the image of God and the likeness of God. And so we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. As Jesus is the visible representation of God. Every human life is a representation of who God is. All humans are image bearers of God from the womb to the tomb. Everyone matters to God because His image is in every person. From the least of these to the greatest of these. From small to great, young, old, healthy, sick, rich or poor. Listen, the whole world has lost sight that all humans are made in the image of God. And how do I know that's true? Because we listen to the news. And we find out where the latest shooting was and what's near us. We scroll through social media and see how people treat each other. We have lost our way. And as the church, who is, and I believe this, is the hope of the world, we need to give the world sight. We need to help them see. We need to help people see, not just hear what the Bible teaches. They need to see what the Bible teaches, for we are community beings made in the image and likeness of God. This means that we go out of here still worshiping God. We go out, and in our going, think of the Great Commission, the world sees themselves and each other if we do what we're called to do. They see themselves and they see each other as God sees them. And as they see the reality of being made in the image of God, they won't listen to the other voices. They'll listen to God's. And when they hear God's voice, they'll believe it, just like James and Aidan did a couple of weeks ago. So, how are you and I going to do that? How are you and I going to do that? Made in the image of God. Midiog? It's a phrase that was made up by Sammy Marshall. How do we respond to this truth? That we're made in the image of God, that all people are made in the image of God. How do we apply the truths from this sermon that we are made in the image of God? It's a simple but powerful response. Either you want information or you want transformation. And so we get application. It's a simple but powerful response. As you leave this morning, I want you to look into that mirror and say out loud, or say it to yourself, I am made in the image of God, and then go live like it. That's it. What I want you to do in response to the sermon is simple but powerful. I want you to look in that mirror and say to yourself, or say it out loud, or I'll stand next to you and say it for you. As you look at yourself, that you are made in the image of God, in the likeness of God, and then go live it this week. And when you look in that mirror, remember this, and here's application. You have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its Creator. You understand what I'm asking you to do? God bless you. God bless you in your believing that you are the image, that you are the reflection of God. Gabe, you can come up.